Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings to the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to a poem that's often anthologized by the Bivouac's Fitful Flame, poem number 13 of the 43 of Drum Taps. The first thing I want to say about this poem is that you will find in the comments section that I've already given a full explication of this poem once before. And so I would recommend to you that you might want to take a look at it. And actually my assumptions here will be that not only have you watched that lecture, but you've also been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down the left-hand side, Talks with Walt, our playlist. And then you've been with us from the very beginning, from inscriptions all the way up to and including our introduction to Drum Taps, and of course our comments that we've recently made on Army Corps on the March. Our Nortons will tell us that, that this poem has remained unchanged through all the different editions. And the poem is a significant poem once we give some consideration to the word bivouac. Obviously, we've seen this word bivouac a couple of poems ago as well. And when we look at bivouac on a mountainside and then by the bivouac's fitful flame, we will find ourselves remembering a set of lines from Song of Myself, passage 4. It runs, do you remember this? Battles, the horrors of fratricidal war, the fever of doubtful new, the fitful events. The idea here is that everything in wartime is fitful. So the first place we want to pay attention is this word fitful. And we're gonna see it again in Come Up From the Fields, the next poem. I think one of the things Whitman's trying to capture is what he lived through. As I say in my previous lecture on this poem, there was such a horror that Whitman experienced. He wrote about both what he saw as well as what he heard through the experience of working in the field hospitals and then of course the hospitals themselves. One of the things that we want to point out though here for Whitman is that he always was taking the view of the other. I think this is what all great authors, all great writers, all great artists seek to do. And he would often ask, what is it like to be a soldier there out in the field, sitting next to a bivouac, a temporary encampment, especially maybe a security detail, and you got your little flame. It can't be a large one because obviously you can't draw attention to yourself, and you can see things moving out there in the dark, and you don't know exactly what it is, and you get to live constantly with the dread fear of this may be the end, this may be all. And as you're trying to stay awake late into the night, early into the morning maybe, and you're trying to be a protector, where does your mind go? Let's just enjoy now Whitman's portrayal of that and the persona. And notice that the poem will begin and end. If the last poem began and end with advances, here we're going to literally get the exact same line. The one exception, obviously, is a comma versus a period. By the bivouac's fitful flame, a procession winding around me, solemn and sweet and slow. But first, I note the tents of the sleeping army, the fields and woods' dim outline, the darkness lit by spots of kindled fire, the silence. Like a phantom far or near, an occasional figure moving, the shrubs and trees, as I lift my eyes, they seem to be stealthily watching me, while wind in procession thoughts, oh, tender and wondrous thoughts of life and death, of home and the past and loved, and of those that are far away. A solemn and slow procession there as I sit on the ground by the bivouac's fitful flame. It will be, of course, texts like Crane's Red Badge of Courage that will later, after the fact, try to demonstrate the many different kinds of horrors of the war. And one obvious challenge for those of Whitman's day is that nobody actually gets to go see these battles. There's no such thing as, for example, movies of battles. I mean, the first 20 minutes of Saving Private Ryan don't exist in Whitman's day. To that degree, you can have people who will never have really experienced in any way, right, experientially, in any way, what war is like. So what Whitman tries to do in Drum Taps is to kind of crawl inside the eyes of a soldier. He was never a soldier, his brother was, he wasn't. And to try to give a sense of what that must be like. And notice we began with the fitful flame in the dark. And then the word procession. Notice a procession winding around me. Solemn. Notice all the S sounds again. Just go through drum taps and notice all the hard S sibilant sounds. As one of my students pointed out, you know, the old musket balls, when they went through the air, they made a sound as they went by you, because they weren't traveling at the speed or velocity that our firearms today will shoot our munitions. And so the S sound is an interesting sound for drum taps, which is, of course, the last sound in the word taps, right? A procession winding around me, solemn and sweet and slow. In other words, images that are going to come out. And again, this is Whitman at his Shakespeare best. In other words, it's almost literally like you're sitting there looking at the fire, and there's this procession, this drama that will happen in the mind's eye, on the stage of the mind, as one looks into the fire. Of course, the fire can be a symbol as well, as we've said in earlier poems, and then the dash. But first, I note, in other words, now we're going to get this procession, is in first this, first this, first this. Notice that he'll begin with the most immediate, and then almost like concentric circles move out, 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 out. And the first thing that he sees, of course, are all the tents of the sleeping army. So I'm awake, I'm on duty, I'm the sentry, and everyone else is sleeping. And my job is to protect them. We think, of course, of any number of moments when you have these kind of peaceful resonances in the Iliad and the Odyssey. And of course we have catastrophe in the Aeneid that will play the same game, right, of killing people while they're asleep and all of that. The fields and the woods out beyond. In other words, you can see a little bit of light, and then out beyond there's the darkness. Dim outline. The use of the word dim set up against the darkness of the next line will give us a sense there's so little that you can actually see. We're back to, of course, Plato's Republic in Republic 7 and the shadows on the wall. There's not a lot you can see, there's not a lot you can understand epistemologically, as we've said in our Big Five. There's just not a lot that you understand in the middle of war. The darkness lit by spots of kindled fire. In other words, there's things I can see, there's things I can't see. And then a comma, and then the phrase, the silence. And anytime I read this poem, I find myself pausing with that one. Because think of it, all day you've got noise if you are engaged in battle. But in the evening, unless of course the battle continues or rages into the evening, there's this eerie silence that will be written about by any number of people in conflicts in the theater of war. And then a very interesting Dante-like simile, like a phantom. And this will take us back to earlier poems as well, where phantoms come out of the ground to wander in front of Whitman's eyes down the streets of Boston or wherever. Like a phantom far or near, an occasional figure moving. Now, Shakespeare's going to come to mind to Whitman's audience, especially the opening scene of Hamlet, where you'll have two locked and loaded guards who are afraid of each other. Who's there? Stand and deliver. You know, this idea that I'm not going to say to you who I am until you say to me who you are. Why? Because Hamlet's father's ghost is walking around the battlements. Shakespeare will definitely be the one that comes to mind here for Whitman's audience, because you know his readers all know this ghost, this phantom. And notice the occasional figure moving. The shrubs and trees are way out there, you know, and then notice in parenthetics, as I lift my eyes from the flame up, they seem to be stealthily watching me. It's a remarkable moment, I think, in Whitman's ability to take the sense of the other. The Bhagavad Gita, of course, tells us to see oneself in all being and all being in oneself. And I think Whitman, as a poet, tries to occasionally play this game where he takes the position of the other and he asks, what is it that I'm looking at? And there's things moving, and I'm not sure, are they watching me? Is it possibly an animal? Is it possibly the enemy? You have this feeling in the silence of fitful, right? You're not always sure. While he says, wind in procession thoughts. This again, use of the word procession for the second time and soon the third time. In other words, it's as if the mind is like a theater where there's all this stuff coming out. All these different kinds of thoughts happening. Oh, tender and wondrous thoughts. And all of a sudden, There's a bit of irony here. The thoughts, notice, aren't the horrific battle that maybe this sentinel saw earlier that day or earlier in the week or month, but rather it's these tender and wondrous thoughts. Tender, of course, will be the echo back to Song of Myself, passage 6, tenderly will I use you, curling grass. The idea of tender, soft, gentle thoughts, wondrous thoughts. And then what are they? Notice the polarities, the Taoist-like yin-yang polarities. We have to think of our Blake here, don't we? Life and death, home and the past, and loved, those who are back, waiting, hoping, praying. We're going to get to them in the next poem, Come Up from the Fields, Father. And of those that are far away. Doesn't matter if you're only 100 miles away from home and maybe a battlefield. You're far away. And I think this is one of the reasons that I say you guys need to be reading Drum Taps, because we have to never forget, giving this lecture on Veterans Day, or close to right after Veterans Day of 2022. We've got to remind ourselves that the young men and women who are there in the field of action and battle, they are far away, and so are we. And their minds track back to us as being always thinking about what's going on back home, what is happening, those wondrous thoughts, those far away. And then notice again the S sounds, a solemn and slow procession. So the third use of this word, there, as I sit, we're back to the word now at the beginning of the poem, on the ground, this immediacy, right, of being right there by the bivouac's fitful flame. Think about the power of the use of the word ground when we are in a collection of poems called Leaves of Grass. Now, I think at 2A the message here is fairly obvious. In the middle of horror, in the middle of terror, the mind goes back to those wondrous, faraway thoughts of home. And that's the one consolation, is to think, back home, those folks, I wonder what they're doing, I hope they're okay. At 2B, the rhetoric here, obviously the first line and the last line, why would he do this? I think the poem has this beautiful symmetry to it. And the flame is a symbol that is a fitful symbol, a fitful flame, I think speaks powerfully as well to the idea of drum taps, no question. At 3A, think about Shakespeare. Although we mentioned him several times, but I'll just mention Macbeth 5:5 and the famous tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow speech. What is it that he says? That it's a candle, right? He will say it, out brief candle. Life's but a poor player that walks and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It's a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. You can hear fitful somehow within that set of lines. I like to think of the 3 Exeter book poems that we've talked about and given full lectures on at learnstrong.net, especially The Seafarer, and the way in which that speaker in that Anglo-Saxon poem says the exact same thing that's being thought here. That somewhere way back home, people are sleeping snugly in bed, while I'm out here in the middle of nowhere as a soldier. I think of Rupert Brooke's poem, The Soldier, as well, as a balancing to the ideas that we're reading here in Drum Taps. At 3B, how do we own a poem like this? It's a question that I can ask you now. What is your relationship to the flame, to the fitful flame, the flame of life? That is to say, there you are at times in your life, sitting alone, everyone else is asleep, and what do you think about? Where does your mind go? When you are stressed, where does your mind go to find its solace? It's possible, as some of you are reporting to me, you're reading Leaves of Grass. Thank you.